Hello, uh, I'm Tom Monk from the IDEA Data Center, and welcome to Supporting Equity and Access Through High Quality Data. I want to introduce our panelists. Kathy Hebler is co-director of the Center for IDEA Early Childhood Data Systems at SRI. I am a disproportionality and equity TA specialist at the IDEA Data Center at Westat. Jared Sloan is a consultant in the area of coordinated early intervening services and comprehensive coordinated early intervening services. Also a specialist in physical restraint and seclusion at the Kentucky Department of Education. And Dr. Frank Harris III is a professor of post-secondary education at San Diego State University. Next slide, please. We want to ask first why we're here. The answer is we're all here because we care about equity. We know how important education is. We know that our current educational system is far from equitable. There's a lot of data that demonstrate these inequities. Simply reviewing that data is called admiring the problem. We're here to help you think about how to use data in a different way to help us transition from admiring the problem to fixing the problem, to create an equitable education system that gives each student exactly what they need. We will focus on special education with the clear recognition that special education can only be successful within the context of a sound general education system. Our first speaker will be Kathy Hebler, co-director of the Center for IDEA Early Childhood Data Systems. We will move to Kathy right now. Thank you, Kathy.
Hi, thank you, Tom. Welcome everyone. It's nice to be here with all of you today. I want to acknowledge the important work of the Part C and 619 coordinators that they have been doing in the area of equity. I'm working off of some of their work and some of the work that we at DAISY are doing with them. Next slide. Okay. The year was 2005, and in that year, a researcher named Walter Gilliam published a report on preschool expulsions. What's so important about that report is that before it was published, we had no idea that there was such a thing, really, as preschool suspension and expulsion. We certainly didn't know we had a problem in that area. Katie Neese actually mentioned this particular challenge in her remarks yesterday. One of the really interesting things in that report is that the data told us something, not just that there was a problem, but that Black preschoolers were being expelled at the rate of 10 compared to every 6 for white preschoolers. Boys were being expelled, preschool boys, at the rate of basically 5 times for every 1 time a preschool girl was being expelled. This put a light on this problem. So indeed, data can be like a flashlight. But the challenge here is data is more than a flashlight. And this is where the analogy breaks down. You can go to Target and you can pick up a flashlight and a couple batteries and you can turn it on. Data are not like that. To have data, you need an infrastructure. You need to build the capacity to have the data, to analyze the data, to use the data. And that's what we want to talk about too. Next slide, please. What you need for that infrastructure are data leaders. And we are very committed to building data-informed leadership for equity. And what does that mean? It means, one, having a commitment and a focus on equity issues with your data. It requires the capacity to ask questions, to know what the questions are, to know what one needs to be looking for. But it also requires building a culture of data. We need leaders who are working with their staff to build their capacity to model using data, to be working with their stakeholders to build their capacity to use data. And equally important, we need data leaders who are advocating for and building the infrastructure so that they have the data to be able to answer those questions. It's also about a shared language for looking at data. I want to mention that my slides, by the way, will be on the DAISY website shortly after this presentation. The resources that are in the links are also in the resource library for the conference. So everything, every time you see a link, that resource is in the library. Next slide, please. So asking questions, where does one look in the early childhood system? One looks everywhere is the answer. And every time the question is the system working equitably for young children and their families? So what do we mean by process? We mean the entry, we mean service provision, we mean transition and exit. We mean looking at referral, looking at evaluation, looking at age of identification. Are there differences across racial and ethnic groups at ages in which kids are entering the system? Are there differences in what services are being delivered? What type of service, how much service, how long that service is planned to last? Especially differences in planned service versus received service. We know that services planned are not what makes a difference. It's services received. And you can look at many data systems have the capacity. If you don't, advocate to build the capacity to be able to look at differences in services that are being received. Families' perception of services, and then things like outcomes. Certainly what outcomes children are experiencing, how long children stay in service, and then reasons for exit. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Next slide, please. One of the big differences between K-12 and early childhood is the challenges in finding children. Our children are not sitting in classrooms. Our children are out in the communities, and someone has to actively find them to notice that there is something, the developmental issue that needs attention. So we have a rather long and elaborate process for getting into the system that includes referral, may include screening, may certainly includes evaluation, and then some number of children become eligible. One of the things that we've created is this child find funnel diagram, which works very well for representing the data as to taking a number of children and then watching. Now, some of these children legitimately do not make it to the next step. Some of them fall by the wayside because of the complications in the process. That's an equity issue. So certainly one of the important, and this tool can actually be used to look at, our Child Find Funnel tool can be used to look at, are there differences across racial ethnic groups in how children are moving into the Part C system. And you can also obviously use this for 619. But you can see where Child Find in particular can be an equity issue because it depends so much on outreach and working in the community. Next slide, please. I want to give you a state example of one of the things going on in the field right now, and that is something that Illinois is doing. Their question was, are there communities in the state where not all groups of children are getting into EI, an entry child find question? And of course, this is a challenge because, as I said, our kids are out in the community. So how do you know who you are not finding? What they did was a massive data collection effort of looking to identify equity issues. They looked at their EI data, their referrals, their active cases, service delays, kids who are not getting into service as quickly as they should be. They looked at screening data. They also looked at birth certificate data. Why? Because to get a sense of whether you are serving kids proportionately, you need to know who is in your community. And that's one way to do that. And that process then identified 3 to 4 communities, next slide, please, where they might have a possible equity problem. What are they doing now? They're now trying to figure out why. So they're holding community cafes, focus groups to look at the barriers to EI access in these communities. And that's a really important step. I love this combination because it's quantitative data to see if they have a problem, quantitative data to understand why there's a problem. Next slide. One of the points we like to make is that looking at equity in your early childhood data, and this applies to all data, not just your early childhood data, is that equity needs to be embedded into every step of the data use life cycle. You will see various representations of this cycle. Sometimes it has 4 boxes, sometimes it has 5. It doesn't matter. The point is there are steps in using data. The box we have added is not usually in most representations, and that's the last box about data use, which is absolutely critical for actually dealing with equity issues. What do I mean by this particular embedding in every step of the life cycle? With data collection, it's how are you collecting your data? What categories are you giving people to choose to identify their racial or ethnic identity? How many boxes are you letting them check? How fine of a category is it? Or is it a write-in on other? Data analysis. As a data analyst, you make lots and lots of choices. Every one of these steps has a lot of room and need for stakeholder engagement. I can tell you, I'm going to give you my own story. My children have two identities. So as a parent, I was always grateful for the opportunity to select both of their boxes when I was given a form. And as parents, you know, you fill out a lot of forms for your kids. As a data analyst, even though I had those 2 boxes, I knew that they, in all likelihood, if anybody was ever going to look at the data, they'd be collapsed as 2 or mores. 2 or mores have really no identity at all. Who is a 2 or more? It's a vegetable soup that doesn't really say anything and really doesn't allow much in the way of equity analysis. Again, it's an analytic decision, and I'm going to talk some more about analytic decisions, but it does speak to the importance of the decisions you make and the need for stakeholder involvement. And again, particularly when, are the slides coming back? When we get to things like, oh, can you go back to the previous slide? Thank you. Reporting and interpretation. This is really where you need your stakeholders. You need the people who are living the service delivery. You are needing the people, the families especially, who are experiencing to see what those data mean. And then you also have the issue of access. Next slide, please. Next, can you, maybe there's, go back to the Texas slide. Okay, the Texas slide has lost some of the information. Let me tell you what Texas Part C is doing. Their challenge was about sharing data with the locals in a format that they can easily access. And why is this important? Because if you want to deal with equity issues, you have to get close to the ground. The state can do something in shining light on the problem, but you really need to be at the local level to understand, much like in the Illinois example, why this is happening and what to do about it. So what Texas did, what they are thinking about doing are what they are calling equity dashboards, which would put information analyzed by race, ethnicity in front of people about things like hours of service and things like child outcomes. Another thing that Texas is doing is something that lots of the Part C states are wrestling with, is the issue of representativeness of the family surveys. They looked at data by local program and they said, is there a problem by race ethnicity? So they identified their top 5 programs who were doing a really good job on representativeness of the respondents, and they looked at their bottom 5. They looked at the top 5 to see what they're doing well, and they're looking at the bottom 5 to see what kind of supports can be provided. They also are instituting multiple strategies. I'm kind of waiting for the slides to come back. we're not quite there, but just hold on to that slide. I'll get there in just a minute. With the Texas group, the other thing they are doing, they have a wonderful infographic that they are putting with their family survey that they're actually finding is increasing their response rate. So they've got they've looked at a problem, they've come up with some strategies, they're looking at their strategies. All right, let's look at some data. This data is available on the OSEP website. I analyzed it, but it's not hard to find. It's out there. This is data that all states are required to report. It's Part C exiting data, but I want to tell you that Daisy does a survey of the parts of the 619 and Part C programs, and I want to tell you 82% of the 619 coordinators responded in our survey that they have exit data, reasons for exit. So I would encourage the 619 coordinators to look at it too. We can't do that because that data is not reported. As you can see, there are lots of reasons for exit. I don't want you to focus on anything except the top two right now. What you can see is that either withdrawal by parent or attempt to contact unsuccessful adds up to 20%. We have to work so hard to find these families. And what we know is that we're losing 1 in 5 of them. That's not a good number. Let's go to the next slide. So what I did was take that 20% and look at it by race ethnicity. What you can see right here is that where the national number is about 20%, when you look at it by race ethnicity, you can see about a 5 percentage point difference between Black children and white children. And so the other thing I want to point out to you is that look at how I wrote the title. Normally in a slide, you'd have a title that says something like, percent of families, blah, 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 by race ethnicity. You know, what we are moving to now is a way to really just say what it says in these slides, in your graphs. So don't give it the standard journal title. Say what it says. So I wrote this as a way to say what it says. And then I did something else. Next slide, please. What I did was create a metric. And I want to tell you, I am not particularly comfortable with this metric, but what I did was take, for each state, I took the number for Black children and subtracted the number for white children. You can see that little 5% for the US, that's kind of right in the middle. And then I put a title on it that says, in all states, more families of Black children exited Part C. What I want you to do is I want you to absorb the data, which are, I think, kind of interesting and maybe a little distressing. But I also want you to think about the metric. Was it the best metric? I am not sure. I certainly don't want to imply that white is the standard here. In no way, shape, or form is losing 20% of families a good number. It is not a gold standard. And maybe there's a better metric. This is an analytic decision that one can think about. Next slide. Okay, and then this is the same slide. I just wanted to show it to you for Hispanic families. So I did the same thing. But then I said, I don't really like that title. Why? Because the focus is on families. If we are really about using this data for system improvement, we really need to put the focus on the system. Next slide. Oops. Back one. Oh, we're missing a slide. The slide that we are missing has a title that says, in most states, you still put the slides back up because I need to go back to them. In most states in 2018-19, the Part C program did not meet the needs of families of Hispanic children as well as it met the families of white children. And why did I want to write it that way? I wanted to write it that way because I don't, if we're talking about systems and systemic issues and we're talking about equity, let's put the focus in our findings on the system, not on the families. I didn't want to suggest for 1 nanosecond that this is about fixing families. It is about fixing the system. So in my slide set on the DAISY website, you'll be able to see all of this. Okay, so just to wrap this up, I want to say that it is not, data are and are not like a flashlight. It is really about building that infrastructure, and that infrastructure is tremendously important to be able to ask these kinds of questions, to be able to dig deep, and for data leaders to have the data that they need. I also wanted to let you know that both ECTA and the DAISY Center are working on equity resource supports in early childhood, and both of these, they're different collections, but both of them will be coming to the respective websites very soon. Thank you very much. It has been very nice being with you today.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I want to point out that there is a questions place in the document. I really hope that you all will be sending questions our way. We haven't seen any so far. There'll be time at the end of some of the other presentations and time at the end of our entire session for us to answer questions. So we hope you'll send us some questions that for us. I want to thank Kathy for doing such a wonderful job of focusing on the early childhood system and how data is and is not like a flashlight. It's a lot more complicated in several ways, and the ways that the early childhood system is more complicated in several ways than the K-12 system, which is what I will be talking about. So thank you to Kathy, and I'm going to jump into the next section. The topic that I'll be speaking about is success gaps. So can we see that slide, please? I want to also read one wonderful comment we got from the audience, which was audience member thanked Kathy for highlighting the difference between focusing on systems versus focusing on families. This is very much in line with the charge given to us by Cornelius Minor during the keynote address, and that is so true. Data do not speak for themselves. The way data are interpreted is one part of the equity puzzle. So I'm going to talk about identifying and addressing success gaps. And move on to the next slide. I'm going to talk about what is a success gap. I'm going to talk about how you identify a success gap, or one way to do it, and how you address a success gap. And I'll go through the steps that one uses to do that. All of this is built on work that we've been doing for a decade or so at the IDEA Data Center. Next slide. A success gap is defined broadly as a difference in one or more outcome measures between groups of children. Possible outcome measures are dropout rates, graduation rates, low achievement in reading or math, employment rates, college completion rates, increased likelihood of disciplinary action, increased likelihood of identification as having a disability. These are just some of the many ones that we might use. Next slide. Here's an example of a success gap from a national perspective. Using some 2015 data, nationally, Black or African American students are 1.9 times as likely to be identified as a child with an intellectual disability as all other children. Next slide, please. That success gap is in the form of a risk ratio, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about risk ratios. You notice I said 1.97, and you see that on this table. You see a bar for Black or African American students that's at 1.97. What you see that is that's about twice as high as that red exactly proportional line. A risk ratio of 1 would mean that the group of students being identified is exactly 1 times as likely as students not from that group to be identified with intellectual disabilities. That would be proportionality. But in reality, we never have precise proportionality. Sometimes we have fairly dramatic disproportionality, as in this case, where Black or African American students are almost twice as likely as other students to be identified with intellectual disability. There's another pretty major disproportionality you see in this table, which is that Asian students are about half as likely as other groups of students to be identified with intellectual disabilities. Um, and all the other groups are closer to the magic number of 1 for risk ratios, which shows exact proportionality. Next slide. Risk ratios are written into federal regulation. They're just one way to identify success gaps, but the significant disproportionality regulation requires that districts with high racial or ethnic risk ratios in 14 areas of identification, placement, or disciplining of special education students are required to identify the factors contributing to those success gaps and to apply 15% of their federal special education dollars to address those root causes. I believe this particular regulation is one of the strongest tools that we have. Those of us who really want to create racial equity in the special education system, this is one of the strongest tools we have, except the significant disproportionality regulation. Next slide. So I just want to say a little bit about how you calculate a risk ratio. A risk ratio is a ratio of risks. The first risk is, for this example, is the answer to the question, what percentage of Black students in a district receive special education related services? So what we see here is that there are 20 Black students with disabilities in the district. There are 100 Black students totally in the district. So we could say that 20% of Black students in the district receive special education related services, or we could say Black students have a 20% risk of being identified with a disability. Next slide. The second step is you need a comparison risk to have a risk ratio. In other words, so is that high or low, 20%? Well, how is it for non-Black students in the district? So in this district, we see that there are 10 non-Black students in the district with disabilities. There are 100 non-Black students in the district altogether. 10 divided by 100 is 0.10, so we can say 10% of all other or non-Black students in the district receive special education and related services. Next slide. We're going to take these two risks and create a risk ratio. The risk for Black students is 20%. The risk for all other students is 10%. So the risk ratio is 20 divided by 10, or 2. And we can say Black students in the district are 2 times as likely as all other students to receive special education and related services. That's an example of the calculation for risk ratio. Next slide. So we've seen risk ratios, we've seen the bar graph that compares all the racial ethnic groups for one particular thing. Now we have another tool called a risk ratio table. And with this table in the far left column, we sort of split up our students into categories that we're interested in, just to see if there are particular groups of students in our district or our school or our state or our country that are struggling in any particular ways. So that first block, white, Black, Hispanic, other, is the racial ethnic breakdown. And if you add those numbers for percent of population, you see this, if that's 100%. And this district is mostly white and Hispanic, with a good chunk of Black and other grouping of students. We also, in this table, chose to look at something that's really important in this year with the pandemic, and the way so many students were not in the school building. So in this district, we saw that 65% of students were served in school, 35% did not go into the school building. This district was also interested in their mix of rural, urban, and suburban students because it's a good mix. This district is half rural, 25% urban, 25% suburban. And so there was an interest in, are those groups being all receiving equitable services? And finally, for most districts, the question of student poverty is a big one. This district has 65% free and reduced lunch kids and 35% full price. So this is the breaking down the students into separate categories, and there's and each category adds up to 100%. At the top, we look at the various types of outcomes that are of particular interest to us. We're still there on that slide. We see students who are struggling in math and reading at level 1, students who drop out, students who are in school suspended more than 10 days, out of school suspended for more than 10 days, absent more than 20 days, or failing more than half of their classes. And all of these numbers for this particular example are really focusing on students with disabilities. Just to emphasize the value of disaggregating when you have enough data to do so. And what's in this table? It's risk ratios. So when we look at a table like this, we tend to look for the highest risk ratios because we have some negative outcomes at the top, and we have it broken down in groups, and so we can see maybe our district is doing fine overall, but are there groups that we're not serving as well? And this table is an example of where it's kind of clear what's happening. If you look at those high numbers in red, you see they're almost all in that served out of school row. So for this district, the data is pretty clear that more than 3 times as many students served out of school are have very low reading scores, are dropping out, are being absent more than 20 days, and are failing more than half their classes. So this is a district that might want to focus on what can we do to help those students who were not attending school in person in this past year. Next slide. So once the district has focused in on what the success gap is they want to address, for in this case, focusing in on the experiences of students who were not in the school building, we have to go through these steps we have a success gaps toolkit on our IDC site that goes through all these steps in great detail. But these are the steps that we use to address the success gap. I'll go into them in more detail. Next slide, please. Step 1 is assemble an appropriate team. Next slide. The team needs to have someone who has the authority to actually make decisions. They need to be there for the discussions, and they need to be able to take the discussions and bring them to action. Families of the group we're talking about. The important thing to remember is don't make decisions about a group without participation by that group. Students in the same category. The professionals who are working with those students, general education teachers, special education teachers, education professionals like school psychologists. And often, if, for example, you're dealing with African American group of students experiencing success gap, community partners like the NAACP can be very, very valuable. Next slide, please. When you bring that stakeholder team together, the next step is to prepare and share the data about the success gap. And I'll go to the next slide and just note that Kathy did a fantastic job of talking about some real, exemplifying her thinking about how to share data and how you label the data, etc. Here's some more examples of what you might want to do with your data, refining the initial success gap statement. So if the initial statement was that children with disabilities in elementary school are scoring at 60% or less in reading, you want to begin to think about what's happening. You want to think about who the problem affects, where is the problem occurring, when is the problem occurring, to what extent is the problem occurring, how do you know, what evidence supports your statement. I'm not going to go through those details here, but you can refine your success gap statement as we see at the bottom of that slide by looking more carefully at the data with your stakeholders. Next slide. Once you have really refined your success gap statement, you need to determine the actionable root cause. This is what takes you from admiring the problem to addressing the problem. And you'll find more detail on our site, but the theory that we work from is that there are 7 essential elements of successful instruction for all children. Decisions need to be made based on data. The instruction needs to be responsive to those children. The core instructional program needs to be strong, especially for that group of students who is experiencing the success gap. You need to see universal screening and progress monitoring, as Kathy pointed out in the early childhood realm. Evidence-based interventions are so important. Leadership must be engaged in addressing these equity issues, and parents must be engaged. Next slide. This is a picture of what our success gap rubric looks like. If you go to the IDC site, you'll be able to take a look at this, and you can see it's designed for that team to use their data and to use their knowledge from all the perspectives they bring of the system to rate the district in a number of these categories. Next slide. Next step is to create an action plan. Next slide, based on the root cause. And there's a series of questions here that you might want to consider. What do you need to create improvement? How do you break down the improvement into manageable steps? Who's responsible? How do you plan for continuity? Next slide. Once you have created the application plan, you need to implement it and monitor it. Next slide. We're working on a new version of the Success Gaps Toolkit that takes us deeper into this side especially. You want to keep track of these questions. How do you know that the implementation was carried out? What data will help you know if it was carried out? What data points are the key markers? What are your intermediate outcomes, your short-term outcomes? You may not change those risk ratios the first year, but you need to know what you expect to see as you lead up to that. Next slide, please. I'm Tom Monk. I'm from Westat, working with the IDA Data Center. I hope you'll reach out to me with any questions, and I hope you'll come to the IDC site to see more about our Success Gaps Toolkit. Next slide. Slide. Next slide. Now I want to introduce Jared Sloan from the Kentucky Department of Education. Jared.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time this afternoon to be a part of this session. To kind of build on what Tom started there a moment ago, you know, the pieces of everything is a building block as far as we're concerned. We started out about 4 to 5 years ago here in Kentucky looking for an option to do a risk assessment for our districts, which obviously is required under the legislation that Tom referenced a moment ago, the 300.646. We settled on using that success gaps rubric as the building block for our CCEIS and our CEIS system in our state. Next slide, please. So in Kentucky, we have a multi-pronged support system for our districts. Everything, again, builds on top of each other. Obviously, the department has myself, who I am a consultant. I joke and say that I'm kind of a Swiss Army knife where this is concerned. I do a little bit of the finance, I do the data, a little bit of the data, and I do the implementation piece with local districts. So I know a lot of other states segment that, but in Kentucky, given my experience as a principal and some other things, the decision was made that I would handle a lot of those along with some of our partners internally in the state to sort of oversee that, as it were. Obviously, we work with, if you haven't heard of them, the Kentucky ABRI, formerly led by Dr. Terry Scott, who I know is well known around the country, the Kentucky Academic and Behavioral Response and Intervention. That is one of our TA folks that we sponsor here in Kentucky. And they actually work one-on-one with smaller. We have a lot of independent districts in the state, and we have some first-year districts. So strategically, as our districts get identified with significant disproportionality, those are assigned to folks directly with Kentucky ABRI. We also have worked with the IDEA Data Center with Tom and with Nancy O'Hara, with several other folks there. And we also have a partnership with our local special education cooperatives to offer a more direct piece of support systems for our local districts. Next slide, please. So each year, each district is required to participate in a required KDE CCEIS training. That begins, and again, I want to stress the point here, there's different training based upon the year of implementation or identification for CCEIS for each of these districts. And Tom and some other folks at IDC have been very instrumental in helping us with those trainings, actually, and conduct quite a bit of that training for us. What we do is we start off looking at the root cause, and we use those root cause analyses to really determine what's going on in the district to contribute to the significant disproportionality. So obviously we've got a couple of layers that apply there, but each training, each district is required to bring to the training a core group of at least 3 administrative staff representing special education, instruction for districts identified with a SPED ID category. We don't have any for placement. I know folks are probably going, why aren't you mentioning that? We don't, and historically haven't had any for placement, and behavior. So again, for those identified in a special education behavior area. Next slide, please. So the training embeds within it several data analysis items. One of the things that we do is we look at local data. In other words, we break down with each district, and Amy Patterson and our data person at the department helps me with this and does the bulk of the prep on this. And Chris Thacker, who a lot of you all know with IDC, has also been a great help to us through the years. He does a lot of they do a lot of the legwork here, where we actually break it down to an individual basis for each district and do a comparison and say, okay, here are the exact numbers. Here are here's what you need to look at in terms of where are the students who are being identified. And then we'll talk here in a moment about how we break it down a little bit more throughout the year with our districts. We also, we do throughout the year a series of 4 PLCs or cadres, whatever you want to call them, where we do an analysis of, we do it in Kentucky on December 1, our child count data. So we take a look at those not only at an LEA level, but we look at district, we look at grades, we look at geography, particularly for our larger districts. We say, okay, is this taking place in a certain segment of the county? Is this or of the district? What are the mitigating factors that might lead to that? We also look at outside factors as well. We don't just look at that data. We look at economic data. We look at free and reduced lunch data. We look at a number of different pieces of data as part of this to really get down and sink our teeth into where the issue lies in terms of the root cause. Next slide, please. So you all, and if you'll take this full screen for me, I would appreciate it. So one of the pieces here that I really want to get down to, if you'll notice, this is very similar to what Tom talked about just a moment ago. And if we could have that full screen, I would appreciate it. It might be a little bit easier for folks to see. Thank you. Appreciate it. As you'll notice in Kentucky, Tom was talking about nationally. And he talked about how, and again, this is based on 1920 child count data. You'll notice that in Kentucky, the over-identification for intellectual disability comes largely among white students. And in a moment, we'll talk a little bit more about what that means for Kentucky and our CCEIS. Alternate risk, as it was introduced several years back, has really been a game changer in Kentucky for our identified districts. You'll notice we have a slight Native American, a slight Black intellectual disability, and obviously that white category at 1.313 for the 1920 school year was the most significant. Next slide, and you can take us off of full screen, please. Thank you. So here is another example that we use, and Tom Monk has been very integral in this piece with us as well. So we historically have just looked homogenously at the local district. So we might just do a small comparison. If you'll notice, we look at three different elements here. This is specifically for intellectual disability. So white students in a certain district are so and so many times as likely as non-white students in Kentucky to be identified with an intellectual disability. We take that to the next step. White students in the district are X amount of times as likely as other white students in Kentucky to be identified with an intellectual disability. And finally, students in this district are blank amount of times as likely as students in all races in the state to be identified with an intellectual disability. I will tell you, particularly in our alternate risk districts, that they will see that they are identifying students when comparatively compared to just other white students, particularly, like I said, in those alternate risk districts, they are identifying kids sometimes at a 5, 6, 7 times ratio when you start looking at that. So that's a really important piece of data to hammer home to your districts and say, this is not just because your district is largely homogeneously of one race, and we do have a lot of that, particularly in rural eastern Kentucky in our state and in western Kentucky. Next slide, please. So our training includes several data analysis items. Again, we have a comprehensive plan. Everything builds upon the other. We start off with that success gaps rubric, and then we build into our implementation or our CCEIS improvement plan, and then we get to our quarterly strategic plan. That is essentially, for those of y'all who might be familiar, a 30, 60, 90, where they're required to do self-reporting of data and analyze how many new students are identified for the category in which they've been found to be significantly disproportionate, how many students have exited, what are the demographics in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of a number of different other things, and with free and reduced lunch. They're required to do that analysis in that. Also, they have to do, as part of that, as I said, a concentration on the area of risk and socioeconomic status. And you will see here in a moment why that's important. And go on to the next one, please. So we also, as I said earlier, have professional learning communities 4 times a year. We meet with each one, and that's with support from IDC, from Nancy and Tom and Joanna Bivens, who's with the IDC this coming year. We've had some other folks in past years, but again, it's being very strategic and inspecting what you expect. That strategic quarterly plan becomes the key supporting element to that. So again, we do a sharing of plus deltas for implementation. There's a sharing time for each of our districts to be able to look at each other's data, and there's a discussion point where they're talking about opportunities for growth and opportunities that they have had, that things that have worked well, things that might need a little bit of improvement. Next slide, please. So we also complete at the end of each year an end of year analysis where we revisit that success gaps rubric. We go back and we reevaluate. Again, all of this is done with the stakeholder team, and I see I've got a few questions in chat about that, and I'll address those in just a moment. Again, they're required to go back and revisit with their stakeholder team, as Tom said in the success gaps rubric process, where they are at the end of the year. That has to include representation from the area, from the students, whether that's parental or teacher or community staff that might be or community folks that might be giving support to the school district, they're required to be part of that team in Kentucky. Again, that revision of the improvement plan has to include an analysis of implementation of data by race, gender, and socioeconomic factors. So at a glance, let's talk about this. And this is going to kind of relate to that second question that we have on the screen. And I think there's some very telling data here. In 2021, I will tell you all that last year there were 172 local districts, LEAs in Kentucky. Out of those 172, we had 171. I apologize. We lost one from that prior year with the consolidation. 15 total districts out of 171 in the state. So right at 8% of our districts are identified. Of those 15 districts, 12 districts were identified using alternate risk ratio, primarily Eastern Kentucky districts. All districts were identified in either ID or speech language, white. So again, out of the 15 that we had total identified, 12 of those, alternate risk, white, ID, or speech language. 3 districts were identified using traditional risk ratio, and all of those districts were identified in behavior categories black, every single one of them. So again, it's a real sea change from traditional identification in Kentucky, even with the 3 years that we've built into our decision tree to make sure that we are getting that significant disproportionality over time. Now in 21-22, you will see that 83% of our identified districts are in Eastern Kentucky and identified with alternate risk white in some area. So again, this year I will give you it's all but 2 districts that have been identified. That's a pretty stark piece of data, I think. And I think it's interesting to see that we're concentrating, obviously, our technical assistance to those districts in looking at quality identification practices and looking at supporting those districts specifically with those practices and looking at their identification policies, practices, and procedures to make sure that those are in line above everything else. Go to the next slide, please. On the sheet attached to the conference, you will find that I've included 3 links for you. I've included the strategic quarterly plan that you can take a look at. I've also included a sample significant disproportionality calculator that we use with the district. I talked about that a moment ago. And I've included there a sample significant disproportionality calculator for the state. So that allows you to be able to do that. And by the by, that's all based on the IDC significant disproportionality calculator that's published on the IDC website. And I'm sure Tom can give you some more information on where to find that information. Next slide, please. All righty, so let's look at some of the questions over here. Tom, I don't know if you want to step in here and maybe read 1 or 2 of these questions.
Sure. The 2 questions for you. One is, you mentioned including specific representatives in the core team. Have you considered requiring a general educator as part of the team? What about the school counselor, social worker, or are they typically one of the administrators?
And that's an excellent question. And Tom is actually part of the training, and he's seen how things happen in Kentucky and has given a lot of advice on how this works. They actually are a required member of the core team. If you go back and we've got a form that each district is required to complete, they're required to have someone from the instruction side, not just special education. And I recommend in Kentucky, that is the instructional supervisor. I also recommend that they include administrators, special education teachers, and parents of special education and general ed folks as well. And the school counselor, social worker, because they have such, particularly in these small districts, we highly encourage that those districts take those folks. And I'm going to be honest with you, it's a one-on-one conversation with a lot of these districts about who should be on the team and why they should be there. So again, a lot of one-on-one happens with those districts that I do, and then I also, with COVID hopefully gone, go out and visit with those districts and meet with them and inspect their programs and have conversations with them in the local districts.
The next question is, what is the percentage of white and black students in the general population of Kentucky? Your chart shows that white students are more likely to be identified with an intellectual disability.
And that's a very good question. And obviously, I don't want to, I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I can get you pretty doggone close. We look at in Kentucky, right at above 70% of our students are white. And I want to say it obviously changes from year to year. And I want to say last year it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 73, with all other races being the difference there. I think that last year, if I remember correctly, black students made up somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 to 20% of the population. So 73, give or take, 20, give or take. And now we'll tell you that if you look demographically, all of those are pretty much clustered in specific areas of the state, particularly those that are more metropolitan than others.
Very good. That's the questions. I just want to thank Jared for being willing to talk about what I have been privileged to participate in, which is Kentucky's implementation of this significant disproportionality regulation and the requirement for comprehensive coordinated early intervening services, and the way it is data-based. The regulation by its nature is data-based, but it's so important to move beyond those numbers to find the root causes and then to create action plans and implement action plans and monitor action plans. And Kentucky's doing such a good job that I'm thrilled to hear Jared talk about that.
Well, thanks, Tom. I appreciate it. And we appreciate your help here in Kentucky, IDC, and all of our other partners that we have as well.
Very good. Let's move on to Dr. Frank Harris. He is professor of post-secondary education at San Diego State, and he's going to discuss some broader topics of data sense-making, goal setting, action planning. And he's going to show us how to pursue all of our work with an equity mindset, how to critically review disaggregated data, how to set appropriate equity goals, and he's going to close by demonstrating a very powerful action planning framework. Dr. Harris?
Thank you, Tom. Of course, I have the unenviable position of following 3 excellent presentations, but I want to do my best to close us out and take us home here. I do think ending with me is very appropriate, because in some ways I'm going to take us back to where the conversation started with Kathy. And so I think this would be a good way to sort of, wrap up the formal presentation of this webinar, and to kind of get us more thinking about some of the questions, more specific questions that have been posed in the chat. Next slide. And so I never like to have a conversation about equity without first defining, what that concept means, how am I operationalizing it, and what is it, how is it reflective in my work? And so in the work that I do, which is mostly on the post-secondary side, but not exclusively, when we talk about equity, we're focusing on groups who experience disproportionate impact in order to remediate disparities in their experiences and outcomes. And notice I said remediate the disparities, not remediate the students. And so with regard to experiences and outcomes, I would say that a lot of the data that we are accustomed to looking at, to identify areas of disproportionate impact, tends to be more quantitative in nature. And that gives us a pretty good sense of sort of where we may have disproportionate impact and outcomes. The quantitative data typically don't give us much guidance and direction with regard to disproportionate impact in experiences. And that's where we have to talk with students. We have to talk with families. We have to get a sense of how are folks experiencing the context, experiencing a school, a program, a class setting, whatever it may be, from their own perspective, in their own voices, and speaking to their own lived experiences. And in the next slide, we see that whenever we're talking about disproportionate impact, there are certain groups of students who consistently show up as disproportionately impacted, regardless of what data we're looking at, regardless of how we disaggregate that data, and so forth. Next slide. And this is a small snapshot of who these students who consistently show up as being disproportionately impacted. Two things of note here is that this is by no means an exhaustive list. Of course, there are other student groups that are not represented here that are also chronically disproportionately impacted. And then, of course, we have an incredible amount of intersectionality that exists even amongst a small handful of groups that are represented on this slide, right? So we know students can be racially minoritized as well as Pell eligible, Pell eligible meaning Pell Grant eligible, which is an indicator that is often used for socioeconomic status in post-secondary education. And of course, be a student with disability. And so we have to have this intersectional mindset as we make sense of data and as we engage in this work. Next slide. And then there's the concept of equity mindedness, which I like to describe as the linchpin of equity. It is the way in which we bring life and we bring action to our equity work. This concept actually comes from a colleague, Dr. Stella Ben-Simone, who's a recently retired professor at the University of Southern California and also is director of the Center for Urban Education. And Stella typically, for the most part, says that when we're equity minded, there are certain characteristics, there are certain ideas, there's a certain way that we make sense of the disparities that we're seeing. And so to be equity minded means that we're systemically aware. So we recognize and understand that disproportionate impact and inequity is not just an issue that we're dealing with in education, but the same students and the same families and the same communities that are disproportionately impacted in education are also not well served by our justice system, by our healthcare system, by the workforce, and so forth. And so we have to have this local focus, but a larger perspective in terms of making sense of inequity. We also have to be racially conscious and affirming. And I know race is often a concept that many of us, many educators are not comfortable, having critical conversations about. And so we have to recognize and understand that although race is a socially constructed concept, it has real life implications for opportunity. It has real life implications for eradicating disparities and outcomes and so forth. We also have to demand institutional responsibility and accountability. And that means that we can no longer start our conversations about student success by asking what's wrong with the students. We really have to ask ourselves, what is wrong with our systems? What is wrong with our institutions, our schools, our colleges, whatever it may be? That's where we need to start when it comes to looking at things through the lens of institutional responsibility. We have to assume some personal responsibility and accountability as well. And so we cannot proclaim to be an effective educator if we are not contributing, if we are contributing to inequity and we're not taking intentional steps to identify and disrupt inequity. And then we have to care about students, care about their families, have some recognition and appreciation of their lived experiences and understand how that impacts their success. And so I should say off for this context that a lot of my work is with community colleges, and a lot of our equity work is focused on bringing folks together, bringing stakeholders together from across campuses, looking at institutional data and trying to decide, hey, where are we not serving our students well? Where do we have disproportionate impact? And of course, what are some intentional steps and things that we can do to address that, right? Either changes in policies, changes in practices, whatever it may be. And so I find that even when you have data and you have data presented in the right way and you have the right folks at the table, it can be really difficult to arrive at some collective sense making as to what are the equity challenges that a particular institution has. And so in the next slide, you'll see that I created a little bit of a cheat sheet to help my teams, right? So if I'm facilitating a group, we often start with this cheat sheet at the very outset of when we're starting to look at data. And the framing is, hey, listen, I understand that this is not something that most of you do every day, right? If you're a biology professor, or if you're teaching English, or if you're a tutor in a writing center, this is not something that is part of your quote unquote job description. And so I recognize that there may need to be some scaffolding and there may need to be some support in terms of helping folks understand what are they looking at and what sense they should be making out of what they're looking at. And so we start with this cheat sheet. And so I say, pay attention to what are some patterns of inequity that immediately jump out? What are the things that you immediately notice? And make note of those things. And are there certain groups who appear to be experiencing the most significant disparities? So if we're looking at outcome after outcome after outcome, and we're seeing that Latinx students, for example, or our Native American indigenous population, that they're consistently showing up as disproportionately impacted, that's something we need to look at. And are there particular areas, right? So if we're talking about community colleges, for example, are there certain programs, are there certain majors, are there certain outcomes where we tend to have the most significant disparities and where a critical mass seems to cluster? And then what is the data telling us about the institution and what the institution is doing or not doing? And then what are some tentative conclusions that might help us start to understand and explain what is going on? And I offer tentative conclusions because I think most of us know that usually our first look at the data, or our initial look at the data, often raises more questions than it does provide direct answers. And so those questions often lead to what additional data we need in order to better understand what's going on. And are there some quote unquote, non-traditional data sources we need to look at, and what else we need to know? And so I feel like, I call it a cheat sheet. Having something like this when you're working with groups or you're working with colleagues who may, they may not be data oriented. It's not something that they're typically able to do, typically are asked to do, that it helps to be able to scaffold the sense making. And we can't stop there, right? We also, as we'll see in the next slide, have to make sure we're building capacity amongst teams to engage in a critical dialogue of the disaggregated data, right? So it's not even enough to say, hey, our Latinx students seem to be disproportionately impacted. I noticed that they're suspended or expelled or experiencing discipline at a rate that is significantly higher than their representation in the population. Well, it's not enough to just recognize that. We also have to help folks understand what questions should they be asking, right? And so we can talk about critical probing. So maybe there are some disparities that folks aren't noticing, and that we need to be able to say, hey, I noticed this is going on. Does anyone else notice this? Or racial reframing, we often know, again, when we talk about equity mindedness and we've talked about race consciousness, we have colleagues, and we can often be reluctant to engage in a transparent conversation about the realities of race. And so sometimes, even when we recognize disparities, and even when we engage in some critical probing, there can still be a hesitancy to apply a racial lens or a racial equity perspective to that. And so racial reframing is saying, hey, listen, yes, it is true that all of our students are struggling on this particular outcome, but it seems to be that our racially minoritized students seem to be disproportionately impacted, even more so than other groups. And then institutional accountability reframing is important, because even when we sort of, are able to recognize disparities, because of the ways in which we are socialized as educators, and how we typically make sense of student success, oftentimes we assume that it's all about what the student does or does not do. And sometimes it's important to recognize, to say, yes, that may be true, but the institution has a responsibility as well. And the institution has a responsibility for this, regardless of whatever perceived deficits or inadequacies that a student may bring to bear. And so this is, again, this is the type of discussion, the type of coaching that we need to have, and the type of perspective that we need to bring when we're facilitating groups that are focused on inequities. Next slide is where we have to talk about how do we set equity goals. And I often find that when we do get to the point of where we're able to set equity goals, sometimes the goals that we set are not goals that would actually allow us to close disparities and to close our equity gaps, which is sort of defeats the purpose to begin with. And so we need to be mindful about goals that take the rising tide approach. And this is when whatever we do, whatever strategies or efforts that we enact, that it improves the success rates or improves success for all groups, but we still are left with equity gaps. Or when we have efforts that close gaps between the lowest performing groups and higher performing groups by actually decreasing the success of higher performing groups. And I think when we're setting goals, we have to have a do no harm approach. So we don't want to make it harder We don't want to make it more challenging. We don't want to penalize groups that are performing well in order to close equity gaps, right? The goal is that we have to do everything that is within our locus of control to make sure that we're improving the rates and improving success for groups that are not experiencing success at a proportionate rate. And so when we think about this, really what we want, the next slide, is we want to be able to set goals that give us a strategic rise. When our equity efforts reduce and eliminate equity gaps for the lowest performing groups, while the highest performing groups' rates remain constant, or even better at win-win, when everyone's success rates are improving and our gaps are simultaneously closing at the same time. And so again, these are just things that we have to pay attention to once we get to the point of setting equity goals. And then we get to the point of action planning. And in the next slide, I'm going to introduce a matrix that I put together to work with some of the teams that I work with, because I find that even when we get to the point where we set equity goals, there can be a disconnect between the type of institutional actions that need to happen in order to achieve that goal. And so you'll see here, let's say, for example, that our goal is to eliminate racial ethnic disparities in suspensions and expulsion rates at a school, in a district, however you want to think about it, by the end of the 2025, and that should obviously say 2026, not 2016. And so even when we get to this point where we have a goal, we can't stop there. We have to think about, in the next slide, let's go one more slide. We have to think about, well, what are the actual concrete action steps that we need to take to achieve this goal? And so if this is a goal that we have, that we may think about, if we're a district, for example, how do we identify schools with the highest rates and disaggregate that data by race and ethnicity? And then is there some research that we can review on what are some equitable disciplinary practices? And can we identify school principals whose schools actually have low racial ethnic disparities in suspension, and talk with them and interview them and get some idea of what is it that they're doing, have they created within their institutional context and culture that's allowing this to happen? And then do we need to convene a task force to look at the records, disciplinary records of schools with the highest rates and disparities? And then are there some current practices and policies within the district that's contributing to this? And so even when we get to this point, we can't stop here. We also have to think about it, as we'll see in the next slide, is how do each of these elements, the elements that you see highlighted here, we need to think about these not for each goal, but for every action step. And I know some folks are thinking this is an incredible amount of work, right? And the answer is yes, that there's nothing easy, there's nothing fast and efficient about closing equity gaps. And so when we think about it, we need to ask, okay, for each action step, next slide, well, are there some other district priorities or initiatives that align with this action step? Is there another committee? Is there another task force? Is this work already happening elsewhere in the district? And if so, how can we align what we're doing and leverage what may be happening? Next slide, we have to think about what are our measurable benchmarks or indicators, right? Where do we need to be, not at the end of 2026, but where do we need to be after year 1, year 2, year 3, and so forth, in order to close these disparities, right? So if we know if we have a 10% gap or a 5% gap or whatever it may be, we're not gonna go from 5 to 0 or 10 to 0 in a short amount of time. We're really gonna have to think about where do we need to be, where do we need to improve at each year in order to reach our goal of eliminating the disparities by the end of the 2026 academic year. Next slide is where we talk about the timeline, right? When do we want each action step to be completed? At what point? You don't have to do everything in year 1, right? You don't have to do it all in year 1. So you need to prioritize what needs to happen in year 1 so that by year 3, for example, we can be closer to where we need to be by year 5. And this conversation is all about data. And let's advance 2 slides here. And as I noted, is that typically these conversations are going to yield more questions. And those questions are going to require more data. And so we need to be mindful and ask ourselves, well, what existing data do we have that can allow us to complete this action step? And what new data will we need? Typically, both questions are going to arise. And with regard to new data, the question is are these data that we already collect? And if these are data that we don't already collect, how can we start collecting them? How do we work this into what we do? Or how do we create some pipeline or some opportunity for us to start to collect data that we need in order to make progress on this goal? Next slide, of course, everything requires resources. I like to think about resources, I call them the big four. So we need to ask, what is the human, physical, fiscal, and technological resources we need to complete the action step? Typically, every action step is going to require at least one of these. And then next, we have to think about stakeholders. Next slide. Who are the folks in the district, in the community, in the state that can either influence attention, resources, outcomes, or buy-in, or not, right? And so how do we proactively engage them? How do we get them informed and keep them informed throughout the process, right? What is it that we need to do? What information will they need? How do we make sure that those folks are on board and supportive of what we're doing? And then finally, who's going to be responsible? Next slide. Who's going to be responsible for doing all of this? Right? Who's going to initiate every action step? Who's going to follow through? Who's going to take the lead? Do we need subcommittees? I mean, there's all sorts of different ways about how you might go about this. And so that is what I have. Again, thank you all for the conversation. Thank you all for participating. And I look forward to the dialogue that will ensue after. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harris. I want to encourage audience members to send questions for any or all of us to the chat. We have some questions, and we'd be glad for some more. I want to say that it's just been so exciting, Dr. Harris's presentation, for me, because as I work with school districts to, we got a great lever in the significant disproportionality regulation, but how is it implemented is so very, very important. And so many tools Dr. Harris provided around how to do this with the equity mindset at all times. And some key steps that as a facilitator I can take advantage of in terms of what kind of questions to ask, the critical dialogues to have, the equity goals, and some action planning steps. It is all fantastic. Because I particularly noted that his point, and it's so true, that this is not an easy process. It is going to take some work and commitment and long-term commitment to make these changes. I'll read one note from the chat that came in on the question, but and that is for Dr. Harris. Yes, so often discussion about disproportionality data ends up with root cause being related to system issues that affect students well before special education referral. Discussion is then often deflected to low-hanging, doable action. Do you have any real-life examples of districts that have actually gotten past this roadblock?
Well, it's always good, Tom, when a question starts with, all capital letters, yes, and the next one, right? So I appreciate that. But yeah, this is true. And so, I think part of the challenge that we have with this type of work is that so much of what happens with regard to outcomes is deeply embedded within the culture of the school, the district, whatever it is. And it's really hard to change culture from within, right? Sometimes you don't really see what's happening. You don't even recognize, the cultural elements that's contributing to it. And sometimes there's resistance because, to be honest, there's some folks who are very much invested in the status quo for whatever reason, right? It means that they keep a job or they keep certain people happy and so forth. And so I would say that there has to be at the outset a commitment to completely reconsidering everything, right? There can be no sacred cows. You really have to be willing to question everything and not take anything for granted, right? And that's a vulnerable space for a lot of places to be. And I would say if you're not willing to be in that space, and very, very few places are, for that matter, then oftentimes you do end up sort of rearranging the chairs on the Titanic, right? You end up doing things that are more performative. but really don't change the patterns and the disparities that we see. And so, I would say if really first starting, and I would say at the very top of the organization, where there has to be a commitment to completely reconsidering everything within a district related to this particular equity gap or issue. And so without that, it's really hard to make that the real deep, intentional change, cultural change that really needs to happen, to disrupt these patterns that we see. A lot of what we've talked about, these aren't new phenomenon. These aren't new patterns. Some of these are things that have been going on for literally, decades. Same patterns, same students being impacted. And so nothing changes because the system has been more committed to itself than it is to the kids the students that it serves.
I want to refer to a presentation that was given by the IDA Data Center. You can check the website just this week on districts that have made some real changes around using the significant disproportionality regulation as a lever. So that would be some examples that I'd look at. Another key question that's come up here is that there's a question of when will these PowerPoints be available? So I'll let everyone speak individually. Kathy already has said that hers will be available on the DAISY site very soon. The other three will be available in the archives of this conference. And you should get an email that says when that's ready, or you can keep your eyes on osepideasthatwork.org to see when those are available. But I want to ask Frank and Jared if they expect it to be a video or any version of this to be available in any other way on their ends.
Unfortunately, we don't have a way to post this publicly. So, I mean, I would steer folks to the archive. And let me just add too that, Tom, you were talking about the presentation from this last Thursday with IDC and talking to some districts. We did have one of our districts in Kentucky that has been very successful. And that kind of goes back to the question that Frank was asked. We have had one in particular that has been extremely successful, and that's Oldham County Schools here in Kentucky. And they have really worked. They were a long time CCEIS district and have really worked to get out. So I would also refer folks back to that IDC presentation from this past Thursday.
Yeah, and I would refer folks to the archives as well. I also, like Jared, I don't have this in a video presentation, although that's a great idea. It's something I should think about doing, but I don't have that at this time. But we'll refer folks to the archives to have the slide deck.
I want to go to another question, and that is, how can we advocate for more state funding when it comes to racial and ethnic disparities? And I'll pass that to any of the other presenters who would like to speak to that.
I would say you have to elect folks who care about it. I mean, it really does start with who are the folks that are making funding decisions and establishing funding priorities at the state. It's the folks you elect. And so you need to make sure you are electing folks, or voting for folks, I should say, who really are committed to education first and foremost, because we all know you can be elected into public office and not care at all about education. You can actually, say you don't care about it and still be successfully elected. So that's the starting point. But making sure even those who say they care about it, that they're bringing an informed, progressive agenda around it. And you have to identify those folks and support those folks in their campaigns.
I would say too, I mean, it's this broader issue of advocating for more money for the programs in general. I mean, especially the early childhood programs, and I'm sure K-12 feels the same way, are underfunded. And then within the funds, and this goes back to the data leader point, within the funds that leaders have, it's the choices they make about what they do with those funds too. There is some discretion about what they choose to invest in.
I would add that we are in a special moment in American history right now where, in fact, a lot of states and districts are worrying as much about how to spend all the extra education dollars that are coming in from the federal government right now as they are worried about how they don't have enough. It's a little tricky because it's very limited time. It's just this year, but the American Rescue Plan and the ESSER funds beyond that are very much targeted to addressing issues of equity, issues of around from related to the pandemic, which as we know, the results of the pandemic were worse for the groups that have been suffering the least equitable education all along. But the ARP funds and ARP ESSER funds are really targeted in that direction.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity for building data infrastructure with those funds. Yeah.
Yes, those funds are designed to, since it's limited time, they really want you to spend them to building infrastructure is just perfect kind of thing for that. So I hope that in this presentation, maybe I'll make this the last word. I hope that with this presentation, you've gotten some ideas that you can take back to your states and districts about how to maybe use those dollars to build a data infrastructure that will, over the long run, really create a more equitable system from birth through college for every group of students in our country. Thank you all for your time and your presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you.